Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Rikard. I'm a PhD student at the University of Arkansas. I study Indigenous studies, contemporary Indigenous literatures, the Cherokee language, and critical race theory. Now, this presentation I'm going to share with you all today actually stemmed from a seminar project I worked on last semester. It was originally titled Illuminating the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Atrocity. But as I've worked further on transforming this project from a written version to an oral version to share with you all, I've certainly exemplified the fact that this shared culture of advocacy that I'm going to be advocating for actually is beneficial for all victims, not only just minority victims, but all victims can benefit from this. So I hope you're on board. And here we go. So my research question that I sought to answer first and foremost, that I think is so relevant to our topic here in this conference that we're working together with, is how does media coverage sustain and perpetuate racism in the United States? And specifically, how is media coverage working against Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit individuals and victims? How is that specifically working against them and further victimizing them? So that's what I wanted to set out to answer. Now, it's undoubtable there's a dire need to transform the U.S. justice system, as well as other institutions and platforms that enable and encourage discriminatory practices against victims of color in the U.S. So as we stand together and subvert and dismantle these systematically racist institutions and systems, the media is a sphere of influence that we cannot overlook. Think about it. The media is something that not everyone, but a lot of people have influence and access to. It's how we get our news. It's how we realize what's going on around us, not only on a local level, but also on a global level. So the media is how we really look out and we see what is going on about other people and about shared groups and communities. So specifically, we can't overlook how that media coverage is working to discriminate and to systematically improvise and to implement racism in our institutions. So we have to focus on that. Now, in our current model of media coverage, there is an irrefutable pattern of under and misreporting crimes committed against victims of color, especially Indigenous Americans and Alaskan Natives, Asians and Pacific Islanders, and Hispanics. Now, this is due, at least in part, to what I and Dr. John D. Marquez call the black-white binary. Now, if you haven't read Juan Crow, Progressive Mutations of the Black-White Binary, I highly recommend it. It's a great article. Dr. Marquez goes much more into detail than I have room or time to here. So definitely read that. It's a super fruitful read. But to give you a general basic breakdown of what this black-white binary is it's a model that positions Caucasian Americans and African Americans at the center of, quote, race relations in the US. And this is a harmful and inaccurate representation. It's not realistic, right? And it also forces many other minority groups and their respective concerns out of media's attention and therefore out of the political discourse. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind for most Americans. So this type of black-white binary that only sees racial issues between Caucasian Americans and African Americans leaves a totally unvisited and uncovered type of platform, right, for other minority groups and victims. So I do want to clarify that I am not claiming that African American victims and associated movements don't warrant media publicity or activism, or that media coverage should be stripped from these movements and these individuals. That is not at all what I'm trying to argue. Rather, I think the black-white binary should be viewed as malevolent twofold. First, it has done very little to provide socioeconomic benefits to African Americans or to positively affect change in relation to discriminatory state violence and legal practices against them. So It has done African Americans absolutely no beneficial favors to be part of this binary. Second, it directly obstructs a more comprehensive and critical understanding of the conditions that have contributed to the victimization of individuals of color that don't identify as African American. So not only is it not benefiting African Americans as a minority group, it's not benefiting any other minority group either. So why would we perpetuate this binary in the media if it's not doing anyone any favors, right? So we really have to break away from that, and we really have to start advocating for a new model. Now, instead of maintaining such a binary that basically doesn't benefit any of the minority groups that it seeks, right, or it should represent, right, the media should represent, we need to shift in a new direction and to create a more diverse and complex anti-racist agenda that accounts for victims of diverse backgrounds and ethnicities. So specifically, a shift towards an anti-white supremacy model in the media's attention, instead of privileging one victim or ethnicity over another, would afford a more accurate model for addressing racism and discrimination in the US, especially as it occurs in state-sanctioned institutions and practices. So looking away from a model that propagates this black-white binary and instead looking towards a model that sees individuals and movements of color opposing an overall white supremacist model, actions, principles, policies. And while we do this together, that affords the possibility of a hybrid culture that enables a shared wariness of expendability and exploitability that can serve as a model and praxis of solidarity. We can work forward together, right, to break apart from this black-white binary and overall oppose an overall white supremacist type of model that's being perpetuated by the media today. So a horrifyingly large number of people that have been further victimized by media coverage and this black-white binary, as I've already mentioned, are the thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals in the US and in Canada. And by building a hybrid culture of advocacy that denounces white supremacist behaviors, practices, and policies, we can draw more attention to the unacceptable media coverage and practices, the imprecision of data reporting, analysis, and retrieval, and the institutionalized racism perpetuated against Indigenous Americans, as well as other minority groups. So here are just a few statistics that I really want to put in front of you and to get you familiar with before I move on. In 2016, 5,712 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls were reported in the US, though faulty reporting and data retrieval suggest that these numbers could be much higher. Shockingly, more than 95% of the cases were reported were never actually covered by national or international media. In the US, homicide is the third leading cause of death among Indigenous women between the ages of 10 and 24 years of age. And it is the fifth leading cause of death among Indigenous women between 25 and 34 years of age. Lastly, in some places, the probability of Indigenous women becoming victims of homicide is higher than 10 times the national average. So you might be asking, how does this tie into, or how does this relate to media coverage? Well, there is currently an unacceptable scope of coverage and methodology for reporting on crimes committed against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals. As I previously noted, 95% of cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women in 2016 were never covered by national or international media. Now, this lack of coverage is absolutely disturbing, but perhaps equally disturbing are the ways in which the crimes were reported on, which we'll get to in just a moment. But first, I want to break this down for you. So, a study conducted by the Urban Indian Health Institute, it sought to analyze the cases of 509 missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals. So we have 509 victims. Now, out of those 509 victims, only 129 of them were reported on by news media, either internationally or nationally. That is a mere 25% of cases that were covered. That left 380 women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals who were murdered or are still missing that never had their stories told. Additionally, 86% of these victims had their stories covered just once by media. This exemplifies an unwillingness by the media to remain consistent in coverage and in representation. Okay, now those 129 individuals that were reported on had a total of 934 articles written about them. And what is notable about those articles is that 31% of them utilized violent language. The study defined such language as any language engaging in racism, misogyny, racial stereotyping, any language referring to drugs, alcohol, sex work, gang violence, victim criminal history, victim blaming, making excuses for the perpetrator, misgendering transgender victims, racial misclassification, false information on cases, not naming the victim, and publishing images and/or videos of the victim's death. So when violent language is used to describe a crime and/or a victim, it can cause so much additional harm because readers can become unknowingly persuaded to view the victim and/or the circumstances surrounding their case in a subjectively negative and damaging way. So media coverage that employs that subjective, harmful language towards victims distorts readers' perceptions. And so it's inadmissible that we would let this happen in media coverage, as is the small window of coverage for victims. A hybrid culture of advocacy that demands full and fair coverage for victims, despite age, race, ethnicity, class, sex, gender, or social standing, is essential for not only garnering necessary attention for missing and murdered Indigenous victims, but for all victims. The current model of media undoubtedly allows for an overshadowing of too many victims of color. Only a small fraction of victims and families are benefited by this model, and arguably not even then. Together, we must stand and demand diverse and impartial coverage for victims, creating a culture of shared advocacy where no victim is voiceless. Another way a hybrid culture of activism would aid the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit movement would be by drawing attention to the imprecision of data reporting, analysis, and retrieval in cases of Indigenous victims. Now, there are many underlying reasons that contribute to inaccurate data reporting, such as the high percentage of Indigenous individuals who suffer from homelessness and a lack of adequate resources. The Indigenous homeless population in the U.S. is directly correlated to over a century of assimilation efforts by the U.S. government that sought to break up tribal unity and to assimilate Indigenous peoples into American society. These urban relocation efforts resulted in about 1 in 200 Indigenous Americans identifying as homeless, compared to 1 in 1,000 Americans in general identifying as homeless. Moreover, many members of Indigenous communities live in poor conditions, with many household members to prevent further homelessness, contributing to inadequate living conditions and resources for many households. Not only do homeless victims receive far less media coverage than non-homeless individuals, but crimes committed against homeless individuals are also exceedingly underreported. Homeless individuals are highly susceptible to being targeted for violent crimes, and with about 1 in 200 Indigenous peoples identifying as homeless in the U.S., there is no question that the staggering numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals in the nation are measurably related to homelessness and a lack of proper resources. Now, inconsistent identification and mislabeling also contribute to inaccurate reportings of crimes against Indigenous victims. In 1996, Indigenous mortality rates in the U.S. were underreported by an estimated 21% because of inconsistencies in identifying tribal affiliations on death certificates. So an underreporting of mortality rates by 21% in just one example. Similarly, many national databases that track homicides, missing persons, fatal encounters with law enforcement, and more actually exclude Indigenous Americans and in racial and ethnic categories, leading to misidentification undercounting, or being labeled, quote, unknown or other, or in our most recent presidential election, something else. Throughout the nation's history, there have been many laws created and legal principles employed that were and or continue to be discriminatorily oppressive to minority groups, either from the long-lasting effects that still span from those types of habits and practices, or the continued employment of them today. A hybrid culture of advocacy that demands an anti-white supremacist government, laws, and practices, one that abolishes all such laws and addresses and resolves direct and residual issues affecting minority communities and individuals, is crucial for forward progress. Together, a hybrid culture of advocacy can work to eliminate unjust laws and practices that support white supremacist models and oppress minority communities and individuals in the U.S. The limitations and harmfulness of the Black-white binary in regard to response, advocacy, and media coverage for diverse movements of color throughout the U.S. cannot continue unresolved. Methodology that is advocated for pro-ethnicity instead of anti-white supremacy in our current climate has led to an overwhelming lack of media coverage and awareness for many movements and individuals of color, as well as having failed to overhaul white supremacist institutions and systems that continue to subjugate minorities. A more diverse, inclusive, overall anti-racist hybrid culture of advocacy would afford so many possibilities for many movements of color. The missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit movement specifically would benefit by having problems that obstruct justice for victims broadly illuminated, such as the things I've covered, such as unacceptable media coverage and practices, imprecision of data reporting, analysis, and retrieval, and institutionalized racism that contributes to the startling numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals. Working together to create such a hybrid culture of advocacy would create a shared experience and united effort to dismantle oppressive politics and practices that affect minorities across the U.S. This will prove to be an imperative transformation, ensuring that all victims, regardless of race, age, ethnicity, class, gender, or social standing, receive adequate media attention, and furthermore, that institutions and systems that propagate racism and violence against minority groups in the U.S. are eliminated. Thank you.